Dr. Humayra Shaukat is the faculty member at the Institute of Kashmir Studies, University of Kashmir. She has an MA and PhD in sociology from Aligarh Muslim University. Her research interests include sociology of religion, on Shia social and cultural practices, sociology of kingship, marriage, and aging. And she has been teaching courses on gender studies as well. So I once again welcome you, ma'am, for the session. So now I hand over the proceedings of the session to you. You can kindly move on further with your
Yeah,
proceedings.
thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Before I begin with, I would like to thank organizers in general and Dr. Roshan, Dr. Sylvest, and Safinun Nahar in particular for inviting me to chair this session for this three-day international conference on gender studies. As you know, all of us know that there is a lot has been written in the academia of in the discipline of gender studies, and a lot has been contested and lot is written more. So in this regard, this technical session, which consists of 5 papers, are of quite relevance. You know, I could see from the papers they're very interesting and are relevant for the contemporary times. And but yeah, so before I begin with, I would like to mention a few, what is the gist of, what is the gist of the papers. The papers are on the gender in relation with entrepreneurship. Then second paper is on understanding hierarchy through the lens of marriage and kinship. This will be really an interesting one. And then the paper is on queer LGBT in the Indian context, which was, also discussed in the plenary session by Rahul Upadhyay. And then there will be the paper on contesting hegemonic masculinity, which is actually a relevant paper in the contemporary times. And then a last paper is on understanding Indian surrogacy, which is again, the paper which needs a lot of discussion. So I hope all the participants are around, and I just request them that there will be just 10 minutes time given to them, and within that stipulated time they will have to complete their presentations. And after the complete presentations are over, there will be, the question answer session, and also some comments will be given. Now, the first presenter will be, Dr. Bendel Jelna Iyer, Assistant Professor, Department of Management, and Professor Ilingbam Nixon Singh. And the title of the paper is Gender and Motivation, a Study of Indian Tribal Entrepreneurs. So over to Dr. Bendel Jelna Iyer. You there? Yes, you there?
Kindly unmute Bendelmir Almir.
Hello.
Yes, you are
Yes.
audible. Yes, please.
Okay. Is my slides visible?
Yes, your slides are visible.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I will be presenting on the gender and motivation. This is purely a study on the tribal entrepreneurs of India, and the context will be taken out from Nagaland, which is in northeast of India. In the study, I will be particularly studying on the motivations, the things that drive different gender. Different gender as in I just took the male and female for the study. So these two groups will be taken up for the study. So for the review part, I have taken up certain motives, and the motives that have always been identified by previous researchers were things like self-actualization, need for achievement, respect for work, economic needs, and need for independence. So these are some of the variables that has been identified to study if there is any gender gap between the motivations of entrepreneurs in tribal India. Moving on, the research gap that has been identified and the reason that has driven to the study is the Global Gender Gap Index 2020 also have identified that there is a huge gender gap in India. And then there is a huge gender gap in the workforce of India, and that is one of the reasons why this study has been taken up. Secondly, the reason why this study is taken up is because it is very meagerly reported, especially from northeast region of India. Things about entrepreneurs, their motivations has been very meagerly reported. So this is the second reason. And then the third reason is that it has been urged that different socio-economic, political, and cultural environment has to be taken in order to study about the gender as well as entrepreneurs of India. So these are the three main reasons that has driven to the study of this study. Moving on, I have used some methodological framework. The study was purely based on primary data. And then the primary data that were collected were based on three motivational reasons. The first is the ambitious motivation, the compelling motivations, and then the facilitating motivation. The ambitious motivations are those motivations that comes to a person based on what he is interested or what she is interested in. Second factor is the compelling motivation. The compelling motivations are external motivations that drive you towards something. For example, you become poor all of a sudden, or you run out of your job all of a sudden, so you are driven towards entrepreneurship. So that is the second category of motivation. Coming to the third motivation is a facilitating factor. It might not be of your interest. You are not driven to entrepreneurship, but then somehow or the other, you get some opportunity. Some opportunities are given to you in the form of financial help from someone or financial help from government. So those things, these are the three motives based on which the gender gap was I studied. And then they were measured making use of various statistical techniques. The first technique that was used was that for the data summarization, I have used a technique, and then for the second technique, I have used the logistic regression. So these are the two techniques that have been used to identify the gender gap based on these three motivational factors. Coming to the results that has been identified, there were many results actually that actually showed that there is no gender gap. Some of those factors were the need for achievement. The need for achievement of the entrepreneurs, it shows that there is no difference between a male and a female entrepreneur. Coming to the next one, when it comes to self-growth, someone wants to grow, someone wants to learn something more further. So this particular factor, motive also didn't find any gap. However, as we go on in this slide, we see that basic survival needs, the need for money, discontented job factor, or the need for independence, or someone wants to be their own boss. So these are some of the motives that found out that there was no gender gap. But however, moving on, the factors where we found the gender gap were encouragement from the loved ones. So this is where we find that the gender gap is really embedded from the family. It clearly shows that a woman is not encouraged to become a businesswoman or enter in the business. However, a man is always encouraged to enter in the business. So there we see a huge gender gap. Coming to the next one, sufficiency of money, which means the money that we inherit from our parents or from our forefathers. When we come to the family scenario, it was found out that whatever wealth or money that the family has, they are ready to give it away to their son to start their business, to finance the business, to become a capital for the business, to make it a capital for the business. However, it was found out when it comes to women, the family was very they found it very hard to finance their daughters or their daughter-in-laws or their granddaughters to business through the family wealth. So these were some of the areas where gender gap was highly identified through this study. Coming to the conclusion of the study, what I can suggest or what I came to the conclusion is that the study has addressed characteristics and motivation of entrepreneurs, no doubt, while the results suggest that the difference in the motive of male and female entrepreneurs is due to socialization rather than intrinsic attributes, which means somehow or the other, to become an entrepreneur is not a male or a female agenda. It is because what has been taught at home, because of the socialization, what has been taught to you externally by your family, by your friends, or the society around you. So these are the things that leads to a gap between the gender in entrepreneurship. Coming to the next one, what we can see is that entrepreneurship as a career should be approached based on potentiality. Not because he is your son or not because he is your grandson, he should be pushed into entrepreneurship. Push someone who has the potentiality. If your daughter has the potentiality, finance your business. If your son has the potentiality, finance his business. Or push him, send him to entrepreneurship. Let it be based on potentiality, not based on any of the social cultural influence. And then coming to the last one, it requires a very state-specific policy to attain gender parity and development, which means, as we know, India is a country with variety, diversity. Every state is diversified. So we cannot just come up, as central government has various policies in India also that deals with different kind of gender gap. But then the thing that might be applicable in one state might not be applicable in another. So as India is very diversified, there has to be state-specific policies in order to attain gender parity. So these are the things that I would like to stress on through this study. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you, and thank you so much for the opportunity as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this nice presentation. Yeah, I would like to comment on your paper. Your paper was all about gender and motivation. That is, you tried to relate motivational power to be given, that is more boost is given to boys compared to girls, or for that
Yes.
women, not men. This is
Yes.
basically, you have to look into the basic structures of the society, which is by and large hegemonic and which is by and large patriarchal. And by understanding this, you have shown that there is a huge gender gap in India as per the Global Gender Gap Index 2020. And so we see a lot of women not in the entrepreneurship, and we see a lot of men. Why? Because you claim it that there is a lot of motivation for them vis-a-vis, they are given money, they are encouraged through the process of socialization. That is, we do socialization or gender socialization in everyday life, and it is through that internalization of the external structures within them that motivates to them or demotivate them not to do certain things. So I really, congratulate you for this very interesting paper, and yeah, you can also improve it with certain more adding more literature to it. Thank you very much. Now
Okay,
I would
thank
like
you.
to call the next paper, which is Ayantika Chaturvati, PhD research scholar. She's going to talk about hierarchy disguised in phylogeny, a study of tribal marriage and kinship in Northeast India.
Thank you, ma'am, for introducing me. I have a presentation. I would like to present it.
Yeah.
So my topic of presentation today is hierarchy disguised in phylogeny, a study of tribal marriage and kinship in Northeast India. So this is my structure of presentation. I won't delve into it because I have very limited time in hand. So I will introduce my topic in such a way that Ratcliffe Brown defines the element of social structure as human beings who are institutionally regulated by organizing individuals in different roles and relationships. So we know that human beings are social animals. So being humans, tribals also form a society to survive. Consequently, they're regulated by social institutions like marriage and kinship to keep the unity, sanctity, and morality of the society intact. It can be witnessed in many holy books of the classical religion that women, even in Vedas also we have seen that women had been given a superior or an equal position in the society. But with the time, we have lost that superiority in our culture, in our society. But what happens with the tribal society among the originals, they are still carrying on with that culture. They still give a higher altar to the woman in the society. And this paper will talk about the tribes like Garo, Mikir, Mizo, Kalong, Lepcha, Tamang, Purom, Regmanaga, Kuki, Jamasa. Though we only know about Khasis being matrilineal, but there are many more tribes which are matrilineal in Northeast India. And also there are tribes like Dimasa who are bilineal in their nature. So the paper of this, so the aim of this paper is to uh, talk about the wedding customs of the tribal society, to explore how hierarchy, gender equality, and phylogeny is reflected through marriage rituals. And I will look into the separation, liminality, and reintegration oriented rituals associated with marriage in Northeast tribal society or culture. And I will also look into the marriage and kinship related hierarchy, which is also associated with property inheritance, managerial controls, bride price, etc. In the conceptual framework, I will try to introduce you all to, maybe you all know that, still I will try to introduce you all to two terms. One is phylogeny. Phylogeny stands for respect and admiration towards women, which is basically an antonym to misogyny. And the next one is hierarchy. Hierarchy helps us to understand the complex power relations through which differences are provided, as well as the discursive construction of the subject as positioned across multiple axes of differences. The reason why concept of hierarchy has been employed for the analysis is because the idea of hierarchy was developed to move away from patriarchy as an analytical tool to recognize complex system of operation and privilege that shapes experiences. So this is an introduction to tribes of Northeast, but I haven't gone to the demographical introduction or any kind of quantitative introduction. I have just talked about the religion and ritualistic perspective. So they are basically Hindus, Christians, or Buddhists, but if we will go deep into their religious belief, we will see that though they actually follow Hindu gods and goddesses, they have the idols and all, but in their rituals and their customs and their belief system, they are more animistic, as they were before their introduction to Hinduism or conversion to Christianism or accepting Buddhism. So two, three things I would like to mention here, that cross-cousin marriage is very much like celebrated among the Northeastern tribes. Majority of the tribes are exogamous in nature, but exogamy takes place within the tribe and outside the clan. Hypergamy is welcomed by the tribal society, not welcomed by the tribal society, whereas isogamy is widely appreciated. So now I will talk about the status of women in tribal society. What I will discuss here, I will show how the research articles which date back in 1973 talks about the higher position of women in the society, whereas the papers which were recently written talks about the domination of women in the society. So the position of or status of women in a society is decided by the social customs and the socio-economic condition. In 1973, it had been written that among the Khasis and Garos of Meghalaya, a female descent clan occupies a whole village and the clan is headed by a female clan head. Whereas, according to Geeta Dang's article, which was written in 2019, she wrote, within matrilineal Meghalaya, traditional socio-political institutions like the Dorbashnong or the village council do not allow women to become village heads, and the Rangbashong or the headman can only be a man. Farrar Heimendorf said in one of his books that Naga women enjoy high status in the society and live free, happy lives. Validating his claim, Hutton wrote that Sema Naga women acquires a higher position in their husband's house and is treated well. Whereas in Zeho's book, we can find that the Zeme Naga men are not allowed to touch meat of any such animal which is killed by a woman, because they believe that touching the meat will be below their dignity, because bravery is a quality of men and docility of women. Temsula Au has also advocated that Naga women in many cases are excluded from participating in all the decision-making institutions. The Dimasa tribes of Assam is basically bilineal in nature. A girl child owns her mother's lineage, whereas a male child owns her father's lineage. But despite of being bilineal in nature, the society, in a society, the inheritance of the property goes to the male child only. The next thing is about, I will explain the marriage rituals, which I will stick to the mate selection procedure, and I will limit myself to one tribe for each type, because otherwise I will go on for an hour instead of 10 minutes. So in case of mate selection by patches, bride price is the main thing here. Bride price is one of the most important element of marriage in Northeast India. Although in many cases, husband's importance, the bride does not need to return the bride price, but in most of the cases, if the bride takes a divorce, then she has to repay the money. Child marriage is very common among the Galang tribes of Arunachal Pradesh. Their marriage custom involves bride price, and the amount is so hefty that one family cannot bear to give bride price to for more than a son, which results to polyandry. The eldest son gets married, but the rest of the brother jointly pays the bride price. The bride will be treated as the wife of all the brother. In case of the demise of the eldest brother, the bride will remain in the family as wife of other brothers. But if the bride wants to get married to someone out of the family, then the bride price has to be returned. Mate selection by service. In the Purum tribe of Manipur, mate selection is done by service. The groom has to give service to the bride's family for 3 years prior to the marriage. If the groom can satisfy bride's parents, then the marriage will be solemnized. Mate selection by probation. Among Kukis of Manipur, marriage by probation is widely accepted. They let the groom to come and stay at the bride's house for a week. If the couple finds each other compatible, then only they get married. Otherwise, the groom has to give cash compensation to the bride. The same thing is also prevalent among Garos as well, and that is very interesting, but I won't go into it. The next thing is mate selection by capture. Among the Nagas, a boy may see the girl from an enemy camp or village and take her away as a feminine prize, which will eventually solemnize as marriage. Mate selection by mutual consent and elopement. Though many tribes of Northeast select their mate by mutual consent, but Tamang tribe of Sikkim, also they stays in Darjeeling as well, has an exceptional ritual associated with mate selection. Among the Tamangs, the boy and the girl select each other and then elope for 3 days. The bride's family searches for them, whereas the groom's family prays that they do not get caught. If if bride's family fails to find them out, then the couple will come back to the groom's house. Few members from the groom's family and relatives will pretend to be travelers seeking refuge for a night at the bride's house. If they let them stay, then the groom's family will declare that the bride had eloped with their boy, and they have accepted her as daughter-in-law. The groom's family will give ritualistic gifts and cash as bride price and ask for the consent of the bride's family. Even if bride's parents accept, the marriage will not be solemnized until the bride's paternal aunt or uncle give the consent, because the most preferred groom is believed to be the cousin. Marriage by exchange. Among the Galongs, as I told, the bride price is very high. Marriage by exchange is very well accepted, which means two men will marry each other's sister. This is usually done to avoid the bride price. The next is the property inheritance through kinship. So what happens, no matter if it is a consanguineous kinship or an affilial kinship, most of the time men get authority to inherit the property in Northeast. Among the Galong, the married girl can inherit her father's immovable property, but as soon as a son is born, the property will be given or inherited by the son. In the Wancho tribe, a male childless couple's property will be given to a boy of the couple choice with the consent of the clan head. But the condition is that the boy has to live with them and have to marry their daughter. Among the Miri, the girl can inherit the property only till her marriage. Once she gets married, her property will be given back to her father. A widow who is still living with her deceased husband's family will inherit the property. Sedukpen, Monpa, Mizo, Deuri, Karbi, Boru, and many more do not give the right of inheritance of immovable property to females. Among the Boros and Mizos, the nearest male relatives of the deceased becomes the legal heir of the property. In the matrilineal societies like Rava, Lalung, Khasi Jaintia, though the property goes to the girl child, the managerial control remains in the hand of the male members, like husband or son. Only a few tribes like Lalung, Liai, Mao, Mishing give a limited conditional inheritance to the women. But here comes one thing: when even in the matrilineal society, when the property gets divided between the girl child, mainly one girl gets more, or one girl inherits the whole. Either it's the eldest or the youngest. She inherits the whole property, which eventually
Yeah, please,
leads to a.
please wind it up quickly. Quickly wind it up.
Yeah. So in the discussion section, we have decided that though the rituals and the mate selection process talks about the upper hand of the women, but if we will go deep into it, we will see women are basically commodified in many of the cases, as bride price exists, and when it comes to the property rights, women doesn't get anything at all. Women are also treated as sexual pleasure, commodity of sexual pleasure, because in most of the cases we have seen, in the case of marriage by probation, Garos and Kukis, what they do, they actually give compensation for having intercourse before the marriage, and even if they deny to marry after staying with the girl for certain period. Marriage by capture is also a very much significance, gives a very much significance of commodification of women. In case of marriage by exchange, the women of both the families is treated like commodities. So in case of Tamang also, we have seen the possessor of women, the possessor of a girl had been determined as soon as she was born, because her cousin was the best person to get married to her. So in the conclusion, we will say that though it might look like that the Northeast tribal society is very much philogenistic, but deep inside, the hierarchy, the oppression, the discrimination, even in the same gender, remains tight in the society. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation, and it's really a very interesting topic, wherein you see at one end there is bride price. We also call it as bride wealth, because bride price is considered to be a bit derogatory term which reflects the sale of the girl, and we can replace the term as bride wealth. And we have seen that in certain societies wherein there is more status vis-a-vis the bride price, or for that matter bride wealth payments, but on the other hand we see that they don't have inheritance rights anymore. And also that within the bride price payments we see that it has a lot of loopholes also. That is, that there are a lot of uxorial and genitorial rights which are snatched from a woman, and it is to be taken by the men. That is by it's in African society. There is a study by William J. Goody and J. Tambia on wherein they compare Eurasian societies with the African societies, and they say within African context there is a bride price payment on marriages, and those marriages wherein bride price is paid are called kukua marriages, and those wherein marriages bride price is not paid are called kubula marriages. Means in kukua marriages, by paying bride price they gain uxorial and genitorial rights. However, in Kubula marriages, they don't have uxorial, they have limited uxorial ones, but they don't have genitorial rights at all. So it's obviously a very, very good attempt. I congratulate you, but you can strengthen it by reading more material on it, and then you can also have a deeper, comprehensive, discussion on the separate things, like you have the mate selection, then bride price payments, then inheritance rights. Then it's a very interesting study, I believe in, and also there is lot of studies being done in the Indian context. So I cannot deny the fact that bride price has not been the practice in Indian context. It has been, but it was over a period of time replaced by the dowry payments. Thank you very much for your presentation. So the next presenter is Samson S. Chiru, and the title of the paper is Queer LGBT, Indian Perception in Globalized World. Are you around? Are you around? I repeat, Samson S. Chiru, Faculty International Relations. Shall I move to the next paper? Yeah, please, I call on Priscilla Karam, PhD Scholar, Department of English, and the title of the paper is, Vulnerability and Machismo of Male Body, Deconstructing Hegemonic Masculinity. Please carry on.
Ma'am, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, I can hear you.
Is it visible, the video? I cannot see it from this side.
Yeah, you are visible. You are visible. Please start your presentation.
Okay, there's a glitch on this side. Can you just give me a minute?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I'm so sorry for the. Thank you, Dr. Humaira, for introducing me. The title of my paper is Vulnerability and Machismo of the Male Body, Deconstructing Hegemonic Masculinity. The aim of this paper is to try and problematize the position of hegemonic masculinity by exploring the often hidden corporeality of the male body. And I will be citing a few cultural examples and media representations wherein the notion of masculinity gets distorted and desensitized, and in the process attempt to reconstitute the normativity of hegemonic masculinity. The physical body, as we all know, is a medium through which we perform gender roles, and through this performance, every culture imposes meaning upon the body. The crucial relationship between the male body and masculinity is stressed by sociologist R.D. Connell, who says that true masculinity is almost always thought to proceed from men's bodies. Hence, the male body becomes a metaphorical vehicle through which masculinity is constructed. However, as a social and cultural construct, masculinity becomes diverse, unstable, and is constantly redefined. But in any given time, place, and culture, we have seen that hegemonic masculinity has been the dominant ideology and heterosexual masculinity the dominant norm. So to be strong, aggressive, domineering, athletic, homophobic, heterosexual male are normally considered to be the common attributes often associated with hegemonic masculinity. And for this hierarchy of masculinity to thrive, the existence of women and subordinate masculinities become essential. So any form of masculinity which is culturally considered superior over the others is usually defined as hegemonic masculinity. And this configuration of gender practice, which embodies the legitimacy of patriarchy and guarantees the dominant position of men and subordination of women, is, as Connell rightly says, the definition of hegemonic masculinity. Now, mainstream masculinity exclusively describes men as those who are economically successful breadwinners and heterosexual fathers and husbands. Men have their own masculine space and women their own domestic space. Now, in fact, the demarcation between masculinity and femininity has had a very deep patriarchal beginning, and in an effort to secure the superiority of masculinity, patriarchal culture has always ensured that men be associated with the mind and women associated with the lesser realm of the body. So in short, woman is seen as a corporeal entity and men a non-corporeal entity. So within this framework of hegemonic masculinity, there has always been an effort on the part of patriarchal society to make the male body invisible. So while mainstream masculinity was explicitly defined by men who fulfilled the roles of breadwinner, the corporeality of men, on the other hand, was considered not important for the development of manhood. So unlike the female body, the male body for a long time remained hidden and hence precluded from being objectified. So it is this patriarchal body that has always been the one that looks and not the one that is looked at. And based on this premise, the invisibilization of the male body remains a marker of masculinity.
Cultural representation, as I said, I'll be taking up a few cultural examples. We have literature and cinema, which plays a very important role in maintaining the hierarchical dichotomy between masculinity and femininity through the representation of the body. Now, most of the time, the visibility are regulated in its representations. We have a post-structuralist reader who asserts that one way of thinking about this invisibility of the male body is to assume that any representation of the revealed male body objectifies it, since the viewer is necessarily gazing at his body. So the male body does not want to be gazed, does not want to be looked at. So revealing of the male body is enough to destabilize the traditional hiding of the male body and to contribute to its marking. As for an example, if we take a film genre of the Western film or the cowboy movies, as we commonly like to call it, by definition, it is the epitome of masculine representation. Now, the cowboy genre reaffirms hegemonic masculinity in its depiction of men displaying brute force, violence, and sexual domination of women. We see the main protagonist, the hero and the villain, trying to assert their masculinity by exercising their physical prowess over others. And these frontier men and cowboys are often represented as hard-bodied, fully covered, tough-looking men in cowboy boots and spurs, drinking, gambling, gunslinging. And it is this invisibility of the male body and its aggressive, violent, and penetrating nature that ensures the social ascendancy of hegemonic masculinity. Keeping it covered, keeping the male body covered ensures the centrality of the phallic power. Now, on the other hand, we also witness a complex and more radical representation wherein the male body becomes the focus of attention. We have movies like American Gigolo, which uncovers the male body. Now, in situations like this, the man becomes the object of desire. He is sexualized, he is eroticized. Now, this representation of the male body problematizes what film theorist Laura Mulvey calls the male gaze in cinema. She writes that the controlling look of the camera, which according to her is the masculine gaze, the gaze of men upon women as objects of desire on both sides of the screen. Now, consequently, in this film, normative male gaze is subverted into female gaze. The uncovering of the male body and the eroticized male body problematizes the phallic position of hegemonic masculinity because in this case, the male body becomes visible and vulnerable to the gaze of a woman. The male body is now looked at. He is no longer the one who's looking, but he's looked at. And we can see another cultural example of the destabilization of dominant heteronormative male body in the form of, I'm taking up an example of sports in figure skating. Now, predominantly, figure skating is considered a feminine sport. It involves twirling bodily movements. It involves delicate hand gestures and emotive facial expressions. It demands gracefulness, which is a quality entirely dismissed in normative masculinity. We have the flamboyant display of sequins and crystals and costumes and tight spandex that hugs the outline of the male skater's body, which can be almost seen as a discernible feminization of the male body and at the same time eroticization of the male body. So oftentimes we see the facial expression of the skater breaking into an explosion of, as he dances to classical music on thin ice. So this burst of emotion and fragile movements almost makes him appear vulnerable of his masculinity, thereby enabling negotiations between hegemonic masculinity and non-hegemonic performance. So sports like figure skating help construct shifting norms of masculinity, and we cannot simply dismiss cultural performance such as male figure skating as a feminization of the male body. Rather, we can perceive it as a questioning of the traditional norms of masculinity and critiquing hegemonic masculinity and its representations. It is now about men creating new masculinity on ice, if I may say so. On this note, I would like to end my presentation by emphasizing on the validity of the representation of the vulnerability and machismo of the male body to challenge the normative stereotypes embedded within the patriarchal framework. So if we're invisibilizing the male body, and if it's the marker of masculinity and manhood, then if we uncover it, if the uncovering of the male body that problematizes masculinity. So in the end, the visibility, the eroticization, the vulnerability of the male body creates different constructs of masculinity that goes against the traditional notions and destabilizes hegemonic masculinity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Priscilla Karam, for your presentation. And it's really, a hot discussion on this hegemonic masculinity. And you are talking about the deconstructing hegemonic masculinity, wherein you discussed that R.W. Connell described the term. And he actually was, with this intention that all males could not be categorized within the broader framework of masculinity, because you are relating body with the masculinity and the certain characteristic features of masculinity, like aggression, like braveness, etc. So we cannot put every man within this category, broader category of hegemonic masculinity, and at the same time we cannot put each and every female within the broader framework of femininity. Okay, so this is a very, very important debate which is going on, and in this presentation it's very interesting that you have posed certain questions which needs to be answered. That is, what happens when the male body becomes objectified under the female gaze? And there are instances wherein we see that if any boy who could not fit himself within the broader framework of masculinity actually faces a lot of problems within the family, within the broader structures, as we have seen in lots of incidents, like if any boy wants to wear the clothes like girls, they are ridiculed, they are not seen with that respect. Okay, or for that matter, if a girl wears the clothes like boys, they may be elevated. Why? Because our broader structures, macro structures are in such a way that they are labeled with that, in that direction. This paper also highlights certain question that does the uncovering of male body make them vulnerable and pose a threat to the masculine ideal? That is again, that if a male body is shown like the female body, has this any threat for their masculinity? And also that how does this uncovering of male body, compromise the position of hegemonic masculinity? These are some of the questions which this paper has raised, and interesting. Congratulations. And yeah, you can also improve it. Though you are from the English literature, I could not tell you that you go to the field being a social scientist. I would have, definitely, advised you to make some interviews, to talk to people related to this, deconstructing hegemonic masculinity. Thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah. Now the next presentation is by Sangeeta Gorak, MPhil research scholar. Are you around?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, and the title of your paper is The Saga of Womb Laborers, Geeta Aravamuddan's Baby Makers. You will be talking about surrogacy, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sangeeta Gorak, MPhil research scholar from Kakatiya University. My presentation topic is The Saga of Womb Laborers, Geeta Aravamuddan's Baby Makers. So actually, all we know about reproduction. Reproduction is a product and it is one of the basic characteristics of the living beings. Though it is not only an essential life process, but an individual can live without reproduction. But a species cannot survive without reproduction. Thus, it is very essential for the existence of the species. It ensures that the genetic material of one generation is transferred to the next generation. The desire and craving of motherhood are seen in every female creature. Apart from women, male animals and birds also have a craving for children. After giving birth to a child, loving it and becoming devoted to that child is the mystical quality of creation. A woman does not get the pleasure of motherhood due to physical deficiencies. She is suffering. Society also ignores her by calling her infertile and barren. Husbands of these types of women have been marrying for want of children. Women themselves have been to have marriage. In India, even today, the tradition is that only descendant progress after having children. The couple who do not have a child do not get for some salvation. Due to physical reasons, many couples do not achieve the pleasure of becoming parents naturally. In such a situation, the tradition of adopting someone else or an orphan child has been very old in India. Being a mother is the best feeling a woman can have ever in her life. The most glorious and satisfying of times of motherhood is the quality time in which and was so and be happy. Being pregnant and having children is one among the biggest dream of life for couples, and it happens to be a dream for a woman. But couples face difficult issues is have
You're
another
not
woman carry their
audible.
child, which is commonly referred to man
Yeah,
carry
yeah.
their
No,
child,
carry on,
which
carry
is
on.
commonly referred to as surrogacy. A surrogate mother is a woman who agrees to bear a child of a couple in a situation where a woman is incapable of conceiving or carrying a child. The surrogate mother conceives, carries the child for 9 months, gives birth, and then releases her parental rights, giving up the child to the child's real parents. So, yeah, actually, this paper attempts to explore Baby Maker, the story of Indian surrogacy. Actually, it was written by Geeta Aravamudan. She is a journalist. She worked for so many papers. I actually just she's a journalist, and she started her career from Hindustan Times when there were no women in journalism. Very few women are, I think, that period. And she worked for uh, Sunday, Indian Express, Filmfare, Femina, Illustrated Weekly of India, The Hindu, The Times of India, Deccan Herald, The Week, Society, Sunday Midday, and more other publications. So she speak about this story, why she's actually uh, she give importance to surrogacy. Actually, she throws light on that unfamiliar aspects ranging from health to ethical issues prevailing in this growing industry of surrogacy. When she was writing this book, she has so many doubts. First, why she wrote. She said in her book, in introduction part, I decided to write on surrogacy because the issue of filing wombs has always interested me as a feminist, a writer, and also as a mother. I began to delve into the subject in greater depth only after I realized that within a very short period, surrogacy in India had ballooned into a gigantic multi-dollar money spinning industry. Actually, her main interest in this topic is how a woman who rents out her womb would feel about giving away a baby that she bore. Geeta Arumudan, as a feminist, she wonders if hiring another woman's womb just because she couldn't carry baby herself was exploitative. When we are reading this text, we come across so many questions in our mind. Mainly, in Sanskrit, we have one word, Matru Devo Bhava, which means mother is a god. A mother conceives and bears a child in her womb for 9 months, gives birth in agony, and brings up her child. Much of what the child becomes is a result of both the upbringing and the genes it carries mentally, physically, and spiritually. According to Geeta Ramadan, even though if the child had genes of one woman and is born of the womb of the other another woman and is reared by a third, who is then would qualify to be called the mother of the child. And even what about the Pitrudeva Bhava, who is worshipped father as a god? So if the father who is bringing up the child who is not biologically related, or if the baby has been born of an anonymous sperm donor, then how many men will be honored and accepted the ethical paternity of such a child in a patriarchal society? Actually, what is surrogacy? why the people are opting it. If we question ourselves, we get answers while we are reading this text. So many people have a genetical problems and some, what we say, surrogacy is one of the assisted productive technologies. Among other such as sperm donation, in vitro fertilization, etc. Is a reality of the modern age. In surrogacy, a woman is artificially inseminated with a man's sperm. The woman has not only bears her child in her womb, but later on, after the birth, also hands over the child to the other man and his wife. In this method, the eggs and sperm are united in a culture dish, where the egg is fertilized and the resulting embryo is implanted in the woman's uterus. Surrogacy parenting is a scientific extension of the natural capacity reproduction. Surrogacy needs very high-tech procedures with regular constant medical monitoring. During the period of surrogacy, the woman's body is invaded by the genetic material of another couple. Surrogacy quickly changes women's bodies into machines that produce really very highly coveted commodities.
Yeah, please
Why
conclude.
people are-
Please conclude your paper.
Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. So when if we talk about story of baby maker, Arumudan took real life stories, especially in her book. First chapter speaks about loss of USA, and Kathy's investigate. The character is Kathy. Her investigate shows that it will cost around $80,000 to hire a surrogate in the US, and in India it will cost only around $30,000, including airfare, and some of what we say health issues. Two sisters opted this surrogacy, but one history of surrogation, but doctor her eggs are harvested more often than what is medically stipulated, leading to serious adverse effect on her health. This account tells us that how little women know about their bodies and how easily they can be exploited.
Yeah.
And another person, Meena and Ram. Here they shows how the couples opt for surrogacy to keep it secret from their family, and they use fake pregnant bellies. She's
Yeah, please wind it up quickly because we are running short of time now.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Quickly.
Normally, surrogates declares that if they keep a child in the womb for 9 months, then they have an emotional attachment to the child. But when they do not see the appearance of the child and do not even tell anything about them, when there is a pain in their heart and something breaks inside, the surrogate's mother linked with the child from the depths of heart, and they did not want to give them to others. But then compulsion of money was such that they had to be given. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, for this hot topic on surrogacy in Indian context, and therein you have related, a story of Indian surrogacy, that is Baby Makers, written by Geeta Aravamundan, and she has a lot of stories about surrogate mothers, and therein we see the lot of pain. What is the reason behind their surrogacy? There can be the socio-political reasons, there can be the economic reasons, and we can see also the consequences on their health issues and other things. But at the same time, we see that nowadays this is the modern times wherein we see a lot of females are not, they're reluctant to give birth to kids. Also there are certain instances wherein we see, and also in certain cases there is a problem of infertility, or there are some there are some health issues also wherein a woman could not bear a child and all, and in that case a surrogacy is opted. And no doubt, yeah, we are this is something we can relate with, the renting her womb for some money. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I think we are done with all the presentations. I would like to congratulate all the presenters for your nice presentation. I have, from my point, I have given some sort of comments for your papers, and I really congratulate you. And I thank again the organizers for inviting me to chair this session for this 3-day international conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Humaira Shaukat. It was a real enlightening session, and thank you for chairing it so well. Everything went
Thank you so much.
on time. That is more important, because now we are connected this virtually, and time is very important for all of us. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for chairing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm delighted. Thank you so much.
I would like to congratulate to all the papers presenters. You did it so well. Thank you.